Thank you very much, Phil, and thank you very much all of you for coming out tonight and in doing so showing your concern and interest in the state of public life in Australia, because that's really what's driven me to write this book. And the election campaign last year, which I had a marginal role in, I think is a very good starting point for the concerns that I think we all have about the state of public life in this country. I started gathering material for this book before we won government in 2007, so it's been a long time in the making. The reason I couldn't write the book as a minister, apart from not having any time, was the obvious point that it would have been discounted as a player complaining about the umpire if I had produced something of this kind while I was still a serving politician. But I think it's a really important theme. It's something I feel very passionate and strongly about. And in a sense, I feel like the world that I signed up to be part of literally 20 years ago, in fact it's almost exactly 20 years ago when I, out of the blue, got the opportunity to stand for pre-selection for the Labor Party for the seat of Melbourne. I feel like that world has almost disappeared and been supplanted by a very different world, a much more infantile, childish and less serious world that I think is a travesty of governing a serious modern country, and we all need to be concerned about that. Last year's election campaign is a good starting point because I think there is widespread concern about spin, about robotic politicians avoiding answering serious questions, scripts, announceables, that infamous new noun that I discovered a few years ago when we used to get asked, literally, the Prime Minister's office would ring up every now and then and say, have you got any announceables? We need something for the Sunday papers. To which, when my staff asked me this, I would kind of curse and yell and say, I'm the Finance Minister, it's my job to stop announceables, not to create them. Because announceables, by definition, are a waste of money, usually, and typically don't have much impact on the problem. But the purpose of my work in this book is essentially to go beyond whinging about spin and politicians and to ask, well, why are these things happening? A good technique for understanding any current phenomenon, or indeed any historical phenomenon, is to ask yourself the question, why now? If something is happening, something different or discernible is occurring that you are interested in or concerned about, why is it happening now and not 10 years ago, 100 years ago? Why did the French Revolution happen in 1789 and not 1689? That's usually a good way of getting to the heart of the matter. So asking myself, well, why are these things happening now, led me straight to the media. The answer is that these things which politicians are rightly derided by are essentially a set of defensive responses, reactive responses to changes in the way the media treat politics in this country. More and more, two things are happening. One, the content of politics is treated as trivia, to be portrayed through a lens of entertainment, celebrity and miscellaneous nonsense for the general titillation and entertainment of people, not to convey information or to stimulate serious public debate about important issues. And secondly, for similar reasons, serious political content is subject to unbelievable distortion and manipulation through the media lens in order to make it an appealing product. Not necessarily to make it politically biased, although there's plenty of that around, but just to make it a marketable product that people will want to read, listen to or watch, and therefore will be able to have advertising attached to it. So increasingly politics, more than ever before, is reported as a sporting contest, as entertainment, and where the vast bulk of the focus is on the peculiarities and the behaviour of the key individuals, and little attention is actually paid to the content of what they are ostensibly arguing about. And so more and more what passes for political commentary, political reporting, is in fact just a kind of giant never-ending soap opera about a range of individuals, and the actual substance of what is supposedly in play, should we have a response to climate change, should it be an emissions trading scheme, should it be a tax or whatever, that serious substance is more and more getting pushed to the side, particularly in the commercial media and particularly obviously in the tabloid media. No doubt you've heard the phrase, "don't shoot the messenger." There are a range of standard media responses to my critique, and I'll get to some of the examples of what I'm talking about in a second. But the standard media response is, we're just the messenger. We just report all the silly things that politicians do. Well, that is totally disingenuous, because the media decide what the message is. And this is something that I don't think is really widely understood in the community, is that if I, as a politician, decide to take a particular position, to say something, to promote a particular cause, I have only one way, typically, of getting that message through to a large audience, and that is the mass media. Otherwise, people do not know I exist. Unless I am a squillionaire and I can afford to take ads out on TV and so forth, the only way that message is going to get through is through the media. And a simple rhetorical question: who decides what goes in the Sydney Morning Herald? Is it the politician? Who decides what goes on the 6 o'clock Channel 9 News? The politicians decide that? Sorry, they don't. They present the original material, and then editors and producers and journalists and proprietors, they actually determine what goes on. And because those politicians desperately need that coverage, they need coverage almost no matter what its content, even if it makes them look silly, they still need that coverage so people know they exist. So guess what happens? When the signals go out from those journalists and proprietors and editors and producers, if you want coverage, you have to put on a silly hat. Guess what they do? They put on a silly hat. I put on silly hats plenty of times. It's just the way the game works. And so the media, in effect, are determining the content of the message. They are not a filter. They are not just a dumb pipe that politicians feed content into at one end and it emerges at the other to the general public. They decide what the message is. And because politicians need the media to be even remotely competitive, to actually ply their trade, then they are ultimately captive to that situation. Now, I want to cite a few examples just to illustrate this point, and there are many examples in my book, as you would expect, but just a few to illustrate. The first is the aftermath of the Queensland floods. There was a great deal of media kerfuffle about the fact that Anna Bligh, in a press conference, cried, and Julia Gillard didn't cry. And Julia Gillard was marked down seriously. Anna Bligh was marked up, had a big recovery, and in fact the Australian published an almost full-page feature article saying that Anna Bligh had set a new world gold standard in disaster response for politicians. Now, was this about the rescue of people who were trapped by the floods? Was it about the rebuilding of infrastructure that had been damaged? Was it about compensating families who lost loved ones? Was it about the rebuilding of Queensland's economy post the floods? No, it was about none of those things. It was about the fact that she'd set a new gold standard in political empathy by crying and clearly showing she cared. Now, that is a classic illustration of how that kind of virtual reality world that Australian politics is now conducted in has taken over without us realising. And so the things that actually matter, like how our community is going to respond to such a major disaster, those things become secondary, and the political game, the theatre, becomes the primary point of interest. And we don't sort of notice it. And the end result is that we have big decisions being influenced by who cries or who doesn't cry, not by whether they do their jobs well. Now, when my dentist is filling my teeth, I don't care if he feels my pain. I want to make sure I don't have any pain. You know, I'm not. His emotional state is of no interest to me whatsoever. And call me old-fashioned, but I have the same view about leadership in politics. I actually want leaders who are going to make good decisions and are going to be serious and committed. And I really don't care very much about their emotional state. Well, the trouble is that the way our politics is now conducted, that is inverted. A second example, slightly closer to home. You may recall that Barnaby Joyce was Shadow Finance Minister for a brief period early last year. He, by the way, was one of 5 shadow finance ministers that I fronted up against in my one parliamentary term as finance minister, which I claim is an Australian record. I don't think any other senior minister has had 5 different shadow ministers in one term, but I'm open to being corrected on that. Now, we were doing Q&A, and Barnaby and I and our respective advisors and all sorts of other people were in the green room at the ABC at Ultimo beforehand, and a journalist from Fairfax who was doing a profile of Barnaby for the Good Weekend magazine, which many of you would know and read, approached my media advisor and told her, and I only found out about this sometime afterwards, told her, oh look, I'm doing this big profile on Barnaby, you got any dirt, you know, any gossip, etc., etc. As you would expect. And no doubt she rattled off some fairly predictable things, and then she said, very loyally, why don't you do a profile of Lindsay? And the answer was, Lindsay's too normal. Now, when I heard this, I wasn't sure whether to be insulted or complimented. It was kind of like, thanks. But those 3 words really tell you all you need to know about the modern media's attitude to politics. And this is from Fairfax, the allegedly serious conveyor of sort of strong, underlying, morally uprighteous kind of analysis of politics. You know, in other words, the message is put on a freak show if you want to get coverage. That sure explains Barnaby Joyce, by the way, but nonetheless, that's what it says. There's a good illustration of how these dynamics now actually work in practice. And I had to go away and think of ways to be less normal, which is a bit challenging. And another example, you may recall when Kim Beazley lost the Labor leadership, one of the seminal events immediately beforehand was a press conference he did where he commiserated with a popular entertainer on the loss of his partner who'd recently died, and unfortunately he called this popular entertainer Karl Rove, who was George Bush's guru, rather than Rove McManus, which was his correct name. And of course everybody leapt on him and what a disaster this was. It showed how out of touch he was. Nobody asked the question, why in the hell was he talking about Rove McManus and Belinda Emmett in the first place? Like, neither of them had anything to do with Australian politics or with the sort of issues associated with the future of the country. Why was he talking about them? The answer is because they were in the news. And in order, and this is no criticism of Kim Beazley, I hasten to add, in order to try and insert himself into the news frame, then it makes sense for him to say something about this particular newsworthy event, even though it's got absolutely nothing to do with Australian politics, the future of the country, the government, etc. And more, that's what politicians do. They go to sporting events and try and become commentators. They do, well, I didn't go on the footy show. They go on Are You Smarter Than the Fifth Grader? They go on Good News Week. They put on a crown and a tutu on talking about my generation. They dance a Macarena on Kerry Ann Kennelly, and so this goes on. Well, they do that to be where the publicity is. So in a sense, they're kind of giving up and saying, well, the serious stuff that we deal with, nobody's interested in reporting much these days, so if we want to know anybody to know we actually exist, we've actually got to go out to where the cameras are. And if that means putting on a tutu, well, looks like I've got to put on a tutu and so forth. Now, the final example I want to cite is a little bit more serious, just to illustrate the spectrum of things and how literally the desperate search for content that is marketable, that is appealable, inevitably involves literally outright gross character assassination and totally unfair calumny of genuinely decent individuals who are doing nothing other than seeking to serve their political party and their country, do a good job. Senator Nick Sherry, good mate of mine, very good minister, somebody who has developed serious expertise in particular areas and made a major contribution to the government. Sometime last year, lead article in the Business Age section, and I suspect probably in the Herald as well, Minister dines with Macquarie Bank just before bank guarantee decisions are made. The Minister, Nick Sherry. The story, laden with innuendo, laden with inferences, basically saying, well, shock horror, a week before the government announced its decisions on the 2 bank guarantee initiatives, The Assistant Treasurer, Nick Sherry, dined with senior Macquarie Bank executives, and by the way, Macquarie Bank benefited a great deal from the bank guarantees. Aha! Something crooked going on here. That was the clear message of the article. It failed to point out a few things. It failed to point out that basically all financial institutions in varying degrees benefited from the bank guarantees. It failed to point out that Nick Sherry was not at the time, nor subsequently, a member of Cabinet. It failed to point out that the decisions on the bank guarantees were made by 4 people, of whom I was one, and Nick Sherry found out about those decisions around about the same time all the rest of you did as well, and the rest of the country did, namely when Kevin Rudd announced them. So he had no involvement in the decisions. It failed to point out that it is quite routine for senior economic ministers and indeed shadow ministers to have lunches, dinners, all kinds of contact with the heads and key figures in major financial institutions, major businesses, just part of their job. So here we have a newspaper in effect implying corrupt malpractice, corrupt behaviour by a minister who I regard as pretty much the real McCoy in terms of integrity and dedication to his job. Absolutely no evidence, and ignoring clear evidence to suggest that this is complete nonsense. Now that's just one example, but that kind of clear implication, we've just seen it in The Age in the last couple of days, where there's an agricultural company that got some government funding that has got 3 former members of Parliament involved with it. One of whom has been out of Parliament for 10 years, the other of whom have been out of Parliament for 4 years. And there is no evidence at all of any kind of wrongdoing, but the mere fact that they have an involvement with this company which has received some government grant, along with, I suspect, numerous other companies, that is a justification for a front page article laden with innuendo of wrongdoing and misbehaviour. So that kind of stuff ultimately breeds extreme cynicism, and it is basically unfair. But apparently it sells newspapers. Now, before I get too carried away with my own disgust with the media, I think it is important to point to a qualification here, and that is that, in a sense, the key players in the media are also reacting and responding to external pressures, just as politicians, in the way that they're behaving, are reacting to media pressures. The media, in turn, are reacting to commercial pressures, particularly the emergence of the internet, digital technologies, pressure on newspapers, pressure on free-to-air TV. So what is happening is that the leeway that they used to have to be vaguely principled and high tone and serious has just got squeezed more and more. And that is a key explanation. And I sort of started to get over my anger on this front and get a bit more philosophical about it a while ago when I had a chat with the guy who's the head of News and the Current Affairs at Channel 9, who, when I was sort of having a go at him about the quality of a current affair, which used to be a serious TV program, which is now a formulaic recycling of about 6 standard stories of the tenant from hell, the evil bureaucrat from the local council, the miracle cure for cancer, the new weight loss treatment, etc. No doubt those of you who are fans of the current affair will recognise the genre. I was having a go at him about all this, and he responded by saying, well, every time we put a politician on a current affair, 100,000 people change the channel. And I was there all puffed up and high dudgeon and all this kind of stuff. And I kind of went, that's right, Channel 9's a commercial organisation. It exists off selling advertising, which in turn is connected to the number of people who watch the shows. Good point. A simple illustration of an underlying reality that what we're dealing with here is a problem that is not just politicians, not just the media, but also reflects wider patterns in the society, technology, and I think a complacency in our community that is a reflection of 20 years of no serious recessions and a period of time when unemployment has been very low. So there's a whole lot of things coming together here. So I think it is important to emphasise, I'm not in the sort of blame business here, I'm trying to explain and illuminate. Now, I shouldn't say I'm delighted, but I'm kind of, well, I'm not sure what the correct verb is, but or the correct adjective rather, but I'm interested to see that the News Limited organisation in the UK has done its best to, in recent times, to kind of underline the merit of my thesis, because there is a common thread. There is a common thread in the analysis that I've put forward about Australian politics and media and the events in the UK, and it is this. What I have grown up with, and I'm sure many of the people here tonight have grown up with in our minds as a sense of newspapers and people in the news business as somehow having a higher calling, a sense of public interest and a mystique of, if not objectivity, at least seriousness. That, frankly, is increasingly an antiquated notion that reflects a world that possibly never existed, but certainly no longer exists. What we are now dealing with is a group of commercial enterprises that are in the business of manufacturing and retailing appealing content. And if that appealing content is gathered legally, or if it happens to bear some passing resemblance to the truth, or if it can be presented without totally destroying people's lives or seriously hurting innocent people, that's a happy accident. That's nice. But don't let those things get in the way of a cutthroat commercial business. And I think that is ultimately the core message here, is that we are dealing here with businesses that are no different from any other business, and they will cut corners in whatever way is necessary in order to manufacture and retail that appealing content. And if that means massively distorting it, if it means taking something that somebody said out of context, turning it on its head and making it mean the opposite because that's more appealing, so be it. And that happens all the time. Now, I'll conclude just by quick references to the media reaction to my book, which has been somewhat interesting. One of the things that's been clear is that people who are in the business of criticising others aren't very good at coping with being criticised, to put it mildly. Politicians are used to intense scrutiny and criticism all the time, and that's as it should be, and that's good. But some of the media reactions have been quite entertaining. It began with articles by Sam Maiden in the News Limited tabloids, which very cleverly extracted a couple of references to some key figures. In fact, clearly what happened was, as I predicted in the introduction of the book, she skimmed through the book looking for key phrases like Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, extracted a couple of references out of context, turned them on their head and turned them into criticisms of Kevin and Julia, when in fact they were in a sense innocent bystanders in content that was critical of the media. So that the whole meaning of these references is changed in order to be able to present articles with headings like Tanner Savage's colleagues or Tanner Savage's Rudd, Gillard, etc. Now fortunately I predicted in the introduction of the book that this is precisely what would occur, so this caused a certain amount of mirth in various quarters, including some journalists. We had people in the Australian criticising me for not attacking my colleagues enough. Like all this stuff about the media is a bit passé, but really why don't you spill beans on the Labor government? So in other words, well, who cares if the media is massively distorting or trivialising Australian politics? That's not the issue. We want the dirt on Kevin Rudd. We had one columnist suggesting that the reason I left politics was because of the fact that I was protesting about Kevin Rudd's decision to abandon the carbon pollution reduction scheme. Now, he didn't point out that if this were true, that would make me probably the first person in the history of Australian politics to resign in protest at something and not tell anybody what I was protesting about. So I couldn't quite work that one out. There were various interesting things. There were references to my appearance, the school I went to, my performance as finance minister, my life after politics, all of which of course are entirely irrelevant to the merits of my book, to the argument. All of them probably interesting to some people, I don't know, but they've got nothing to do with whether or not I'm right or wrong in what I'm saying. And that was the really interesting thing, of course, was that nobody yet has seriously confronted the core argument and said, no, this is not true. You know, you've got it all wrong. There's been a little bit of, well, no, it's all the politicians' fault, or, you know, we're just the messenger, all that kind of stuff. But nobody's actually said, well, no, this is rubbish, and here's why what you're saying is not correct. And the final sort of thing that really attracted my attention, I suppose, the polite way of saying it, is that David Penberthy, who used to edit the Daily Telegraph, said that actually I was the problem. It's not the media, I was the problem, that I was against fun and 50 going on 75. My immediate response was, I hope to God Rupert Murdoch's not reading this, because he'd probably regard his sense of fun as being somewhat under threat here, given that he's almost, by that stage, I think he turned 80. And somehow or other, the proposition being put by Penberthy is that, in fact, well, but of course, the role of political reporting is to make fun of politicians and to turn it all into a bit of a joke. Like, what else is there? So, to me, the message from that was that this sense of drift away from serious political content as something that is fundamental to a functioning democracy is now so extreme that you have serious and pretty senior journalists who actually sort of don't even get the argument. It's kind of, what are you talking about? You know, of course the role of the media here is to write stuff about Julia Gillard's shoes or whatever. And that's the key thing. That's the key thing, is that where we are heading, if this trend continues, is a world where the question of who governs Australia and what policies govern our lives is going to be determined on such fundamental questions as what Tony Abbott looks like in Speedos or who cried after the Queensland floods. That's not a world that I want to inhabit, but that is where we are gradually heading. Thank you very much. Looks like I'm umpiring questions, so gentleman in the front had his hand up first.
Do you think the recent scandal involving the Murdoch family and I think to hopefully involve the whole of the empire, do you think that the examination of this, if there ever is a proper examination of it, will cause the media in general to mend their ways and improve their behaviour?
Look, it's an interesting dynamic because this is happening in the UK, so all these things are happening in a separate country, but it's a separate country that we are very closely linked to and that is hugely influential still in our cultural patterns, I suppose. I think there's clearly going to be substantial wider fallout from these events, and although I don't know a great deal about it, I expect that the inquiries that are emerging in the UK will be serious and will have an effect. The UK has, I think, the best and the worst media in the world. It is astonishing the array of things there, and some of their tabloid media just has to be seen to be believed. It is like, frankly, with a half-decent competition authority, they'd be prosecuted for calling themselves newspapers because they aren't really newspapers. But nonetheless, who am I to say? Look, I think it will have a significant effect, a ripple effect, because it's turning the focus on the media's behaviour. And so they have been able to get away with, for many years, this kind of nonsense about we're just the messenger. We are above criticism and all we do is report things. Have you ever noticed that the media are always gung-ho in favour of freedom of information? They're always gung-ho in favour of things like court cases being televised. They're always gung-ho in favour of disclosure. I wonder why that'd be. Because they want more content. It's got nothing to do with the public interest. It's because what they're saying is we want more stuff that we can turn into articles on page 3 that might help us sell a few more copies and win a few more advertisers. It's got nothing to do with high moral ground principles, yet they parade in these clothes of great responsibility and all this pompous nonsense. They are businesses selling products. So I think the great benefit, irrespective of the specific issues that are in play, which obviously will take some time to play out, the great benefit of this is turning the focus globally onto the behaviour of media organisations. Yes. Sorry, I'll try and make sure I'm even-handed. Yeah, good, I've been rescued.
Yeah. The first hand was over in the left. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
What was the trigger for you to depart, given that you know you're so passionate about the state of our country and our politics and how it's eroded.
Well,
It sounds to
unfortunately,
me like you've got so much more to offer.
that's very kind of you, but unfortunately the reason I gave is one that's been a bit overused in the past by some dubious characters, but in my case it was true. It's family reasons. I'm in a position, like quite a large number of other people in the society, but not that many people in the political world, of having 2 teenage kids from a previous marriage and 2 little girls from my current marriage. And I've been in Parliament for nearly 18 years, and it takes a toll. And you get to a point where, particularly if you've been married 3 times like I have, where you can't take too many more risks. So, please don't tell my wife I said that.
Which wife?
That was the reason. I do admit in the book, and I'm not embarrassed to admit this, that the stuff I describe in the book made it easier to leave. So, I'm in a sense a creature of the 1980s, when right across the political spectrum, Australian politics was dominated by big arguments, big players, big contests about serious issues. And that's my kind of natural habitat. And in some respects, where politics has got to is something I feel like I don't really belong anymore. So that made it easier to go, but it wasn't the reason why I went.
Take one from the right. Oh, right,
Oh,
okay.
sorry,
Yes,
sorry, good point.
Yep, right. There's another one over the left there.
Lindsay, do you think that politicians have some responsibility in the fact that because we have compulsory voting in Australia, we're trying to get the disengaged middle to pay any attention to, that we do pander to this sort of behaviour? And secondly, on a slightly lighter note, in an earlier book, you wrote personal responsibility. The vital component of human relationships that seems most under siege is the notion of personal responsibility. Political discourse is dominated by concerns about individual rights and not much focus on personal responsibility. That would be a sentiment that would be widely welcomed in the Liberal Party if you give them any thought to joining them.
That's going to be a hard question to repeat.
I'm worried that they're becoming too left-wing on economic issues. Joe Hockey's out there bashing banks and all that kind of stuff. If you can't have the shadow treasurer from the Conservative Party as the upholder of conservative economic orthodoxy, who will? Like, this is a serious issue for Australia. Sorry, I'm being flip. Look, on the personal responsibility front and your leading, yeah, politicians do have a role to play in this. And I'm certainly not trying to say, look, let politicians off the hook. They're just innocent victims of all this. But you shouldn't also group them all together either. Some are better than others. And partly what I'm hoping with my efforts is that in a small way that'll just niggle away at people in politics and in the media and be a sort of a reminder sitting up in their shoulder saying, well, before you put on that funny hat and go on MasterChef or whatever, remember that there's people watching who think this is ridiculous. Or journalist X, before you take a statement, a single sentence out of 20 sentences from a politician, dress it up, turn it on its head and make it mean the opposite. Or Daily Telegraph, before you run a big thing about Julia Gillard's shoes and how much carbon emissions are embedded in her shoes, well, there's actually people out there laughing at you and thinking you're a joke when you do that kind of stuff. So yes, politicians do have a responsibility. On the wider personal responsibility front, there's an interesting crossover between the two political traditions here. So although if you look back over, say, 100 years or so, then that kind of personal responsibility, which is really married to in a sense, a more collective or tribal sense of society, and a hierarchical sense of society, has had its home in the Liberal Party, and the Labor Party's tended to be an individual rights sort of party. But on economic issues, it's been the reverse. So it's actually quite murky, those value things. And so part of my message then was to say, when did the Labor Party sign up to individualism as a core creed? We didn't. And it's not central to Labor's values, on certain themes, certain issues, the rights of the individual are important, but we are not a party that places individualism above all other things, and hence personal responsibility's got an important sort of role to play in our configuration of things. So the classic example of this, where I use this argument, is the euthanasia debate, where I felt that this notion of of just saying, well, we're all pure individuals and therefore we can make have freedom to do whatever we like is a misconceived kind of idea that has to be limited by other considerations. Sorry, I'll stop there because it's we're going way off the topic.
To the back.
Just a quick one. With the current leader of the opposition, I sort of drifted away from the Liberals under Howard and then came back to them after they had Nelson and Turnbull. Just the question is, how do you see the current leader of the opposition going in the next couple of years? And can he, I mean, he seems to be quite shallow to me. Do you think that there'll be an opportunity to, I'm putting that nicely, do you think there's an opportunity there that the press may become a bit more serious and actually start asking him the hard questions and finding out about his real politics?
Look, I think there is, in part because they'll get bored. And again, they need novelty. And so, Labor in poor polling position is a pretty boring story after about 6 months. So they need something new to happen. And one of the, you mentioned Brendan Nelson, who's a good example of one of the things that I think is a complete joke. In 10 years, literally in 10 years, we have had 8 federal leaders of the opposition in this country. Now, the only thing that automatically creates a change of leader of the opposition, of course, is a federal election. A change of government. That's happened once in that time. We've had 8 leaders of the opposition. Why does that happen? Because by and large, most of the time, leaders of the opposition are up against it. And most of the time, they're not going to be polling that well. And what happens now is that because the media are so desperate to report anything other than issues, this whole sporting contest thing means that a leader of the opposition who's not travelling well immediately is put under siege. The inevitable array of dissidents in their party or people who want to knock them off and replace them, they in effect collaborate with the media to intensify that siege. Next thing you know, their polling numbers go down and the end result's inevitable. And Brendan Nelson to me is the classic example. Now, I wasn't a huge fan of Brendan's. I don't think he's all that great, but he never had a chance. Like, they'd been turfed out of office after 12 years or whatever. They had an incumbent government that was literally less than a year old, very popular, and with a very popular leader, and it hadn't at that point made serious mistakes. And so Brendan Nelson's polling badly. Well, guess what? Like anybody would have. Yet what happens? He's under siege. All the usual palaver goes on. Next thing you know, he's knocked off. Now that's a joke, but that's where it's got to. Look, I don't want to give you my views on Tony Abbott. But
he only won by one vote.
They are not fit for polite company. But your point, I think, is valid that there is every possibility of the wheel turning because they've got to write about something new. There's got to be something different, and the slightest thing that produces that, they will leap on.
One at the front.
Yeah, look, I'd like you to comment on 2 issues. One, opinion polls. I think they're a fiction. I mean, how can someone ringing up 1,200 people then come out and say the country's swinging behind the opposition leader or whatever, or the Prime Minister's no good? I just think they're rubbish. Number 2, I think that politicians have got to get back to old values and find ways to go out and talk to people and ditch the media. If you've got all these press people in the Parliament and in the Ministers' offices and so on that have just come straight out from university, they seem to be all part of a silly game.
Look, on the opinion polls, there's, in a sense, 2 different kinds of polls. Polls on issues, which are complete rubbish and are completely meaningless. They're totally susceptible to manipulation of the content of the question, and typically they'll ask things like, would you be prepared to pay higher taxes to get better government services? And amazingly, typically about 2/3 of the country say yes to that. The problem is that a big slab of them are actually reading a different question that says, should somebody else pay higher taxes so I can get better government services? And amazingly enough, they answer yes to that question. So opinion polls on issues are complete rubbish. And a lot of them are paid for by interest groups peddling a particular cause, and they're literally just news fodder. They're just fodder to get in the papers and say, 2/3 of people with children in childcare would take their kids out of care if the price went up, $1 a month or whatever. Opinion polls on voting intention, not totally rubbish, but you're right that they need to be heavily discounted. They do over time give you some sense of trend, So the fact that, it would be foolish to deny that the popularity of the current federal government is not in great shape at the moment, and you've had an extended period of time where the polling is very bad. But the key thing is not to get hung up by individual polls. The things that really matter is a trend over time. That's when you can actually draw some conclusion from it. Your second point about people getting out and about, I agree with that absolutely, and it's something that I always tried to do as much as I could, but the physical limitations are obvious. So it's a partial antidote to the problem, but the reality is that you can only communicate with millions of people through the media. And one of the factors in play here is that in the old days there used to be a range of institutions in our society like churches, unions, service clubs, non-government organisations that had a very close and powerful link with huge numbers of people, and they acted also as political intermediaries. So what it meant was that if you're an individual voter, you might be getting a certain message from the media, but you'd also be getting other messages from organisations that you trusted and were part of and that you were dealing with all the time. The role of those organisations has shrunk dramatically, and that's meant that there's a vacuum and it's more and more filled by the media, and that's just a reality.
Second last question.
Lindsay, you've talked tonight about all the noise on the surface that we all see. Just with your 18 years in government, beneath that sits the bureaucracy and the wheels of government and policy development. How do you compare that to 18 years ago compared to now, with all the distractions that are going on?
Look, one of the interesting things that I worked out in government, and I frankly had no view on this when I went in, I had no strong preconceptions, is that certainly in the department I represented, the quality of the public servants was sensational. Like the hours that are worked, the notion that you're dealing here with fat cats and bludgers is ludicrous. Particularly in the sort of 2 or 3 months before the budget, but for a lot of the year, some of the bureaucrats in my department were literally at work at 4 a.m. and sometimes there are instances of people working through the night and just, they work their guts out. And they are very, very skilled, committed people by and large. Inevitably, you'll get the odd hopeless one and so forth. That's any group's going to be like that. But I was very pleasantly surprised at just the top quality of the people. They wrote really well. There was a rare brief that I got on any issue that was any longer than a couple of pages. They were really, the stuff they were specifically in charge of, they knew backwards. So I think that's one very positive message I can convey tonight, is that certainly at the federal level, and certainly the key central departments, the people you're dealing with there are committed and got very strong values and very skilled and able people. And one thing I'm very conscious of now is the great merit of having a public service that is kept at arm's length from the political process. So that my former department head, Ian Watt, who's now head of defence, he was a senior public servant under Paul Keating. He was a department head under John Howard. And the interesting thing was that after we won, Nick Minchin, who was then Finance Minister, rang me up to congratulate me and said, by the way, I hope you keep Ian Watt. He's a fantastic, top-class public servant. And I said, look, it won't really be my decision, but, let's see what happens. I agree with Nick Minchin. Ian Watt is a fantastic, top-class public servant. And Australia, I think, is very fortunate that certainly at the federal level in those big central departments, we've got a group of really top-class public servants now. They don't get the recognition out in the wider public domain that they deserve. And yes, sometimes they make mistakes. Yes, sometimes they're examples of individual departments and public servants doing the wrong thing. By and large, we are very well served by them.
Last question. Yes.
Yes. What's your view of international rating agencies and their,
there are essentially three major international ratings agencies: Moody's, Standard & Poor's and Fitch. Moody's and Standard & Poor's tend to be a bit more substantial, a bit bigger than Fitch. There is a core problem with them that there is kind of no solution to, and that is who foots the bill. So if you're issuing a security, so you're in effect asking people to invest their money and their trust in you, and you then pay a ratings agency to give that a rating, there is an obvious kind of tension there, because the person who's being rated is actually paying the agency to do the rating. That is a concern. But equally, if you ask the person, particularly a smaller investor, to foot the bill, well, then you're potentially going to get other distortions as well. So there is a kind of core problem here to which there is no solution. I think the ratings agencies got caught up in one of those kind of popular moods that takes over from time to time in the US, and it happens in Australia, it happens in other countries, where it takes a brave person to push back and go against the tide. So every time you get a bubble, every time you get one of these huge asset price booms and money's flowing freely, it takes real courage for somebody to stand up and say, well, this is against my self-interest, but this is mad and I'm going to try and put a stop to it. That's why nobody does, or that's why so few people do, because the momentum of what's happening is so powerful, and the pressure to just go along with it, and this applies to regulators, politicians, media commentators, the pressure to go along with it is overwhelming, because nobody knows. You know, you can kind of look at these things and say, well, look, there's disaster waiting to happen here. But people, for example, have been saying that about the level of house prices in Australia now for the best part of a decade. You know, The Economist keeps writing all this stuff about, you know, our housing market's massively overvalued and there's going to be a crash and whatever. They've been doing that for 6 or 7 years. It hasn't happened. So the natural human instinct is just to kind of go with the flow. I think it's too early to say whether the ratings agencies have picked up their game, and there is a serious issue here. But I have to say though, it's in my, and this is a whole separate discussion, but in my kind of list of major criminals in inverted commas in the global financial crisis, they're fairly well down the list. They deserve a mention, but they're not the primary cause by any means. They were probably contributors up to a degree, but certainly I'd caution people against focusing too much on the ratings agencies and saying, look, here's the real culprits. They're not the real culprits. They didn't help. They probably deserve a bit of the blame, but there are other players who I think deserve a lot more of the blame.
Thank you, Lindsay. I think, sorry,